Imagine being on the brink of a decision that could destroy everything you know, or transform it into something completely unexpected. Mariana, lost between an uncertain future and a present that imprisons her, must face her greatest fears and choose a path of no return. What will she do when she feels that, whatever her choice, something precious will be lost forever? The answer could change everything. But to do so, she will need to face something much deeper than she imagined. Are you ready to? Discover what happens when reflection becomes the key to true freedom. We all reach a point in our lives where we feel like everything around us is falling apart, as if we're being swept away by a strong current, unable to control the flow. Sometimes it's a job that no longer fulfills us, a relationship that no longer makes sense, or simply the weight of living under expectations that aren't ours. What happens when the things you've built, the choices you've made, and the promises you've made to yourself begin to crumble? What do you do when you're staring into an abyss and don't know whether to step forward or retreat? This is Mariana's reality. She didn't start life any differently than other people. Like most, she had dreams, expectations, and a clear vision of where she wanted to go. But, as with many of us, life didn't exactly follow her path. She found herself in a corporate world that was slowly consuming her, facing the pressures of a job that didn't fulfill her, but seemed like the only option. What could she do? The search for security, stability, and acceptance led her to a job that she knew, deep down, wasn't what truly made her happy. But she believed she had no choice. Time passed, and with it, the feeling of losing something essential. The weeks, months, and years of dedication to work became an invisible prison, where Mariana's soul seemed to slowly fade away. She felt like a shadow of herself, a lifeless version, merely going through the motions of a meaningless routine. The days repeated themselves, and with it, the weight of frustration accumulated. But the real impact didn't come from a single event. It wasn't something that happened on a specific day. What brought her to the breaking point was the sum of small gestures and choices that, over time, pushed Mariana further and further into a dead end. The pressure to meet family and social expectations, the pressure to stay strong even when her heart was broken, all of this made her believe she had no other way. Mariana was exhausted. Inside, a voice began to echo with increasing force, asking, "Is this all? Is this what you want for your life?" But it was difficult to silence this voice. After all, she had always heard that success was achieved through security, hard work, and conforming to society's expectations. There was no room for real dreams and desires, only for external expectations. The breaking point came when Mariana realized she could no longer ignore this feeling of discomfort. She could no longer look in the mirror and believe the version of herself she was living. The disconnect was so strong that it seemed impossible to continue. What had once been a clear path, with promises of safety, now seemed like a maze with no exit. What she had built up to that point seemed to be crumbling like a house of cards. It was in this moment of utter darkness that Mariana began to question everything she knew about life. She began to realize that her choices, up until then, were being made for others, not for herself. The decisions she had made in her life were directly linked to the desire to please, to meet family and social expectations, and to maintain a semblance of success, even as she was falling apart inside. She began to wonder if she was truly living her life, or if she was simply going with the flow, like a puppet in the hands of circumstances. But what Mariana didn't know was that the breaking point, despite seeming like the end, was only the beginning. It was at rock bottom that she finally began to look up, to see that there was a different path, a path she could forge for herself. However, to get there, she would need to make a radical decision, a decision that would free her from the prison she had created. Would that be possible? Or would she lose herself even further in this whirlwind of doubts and fears? She was on the edge of the precipice, but the truth was that falling wasn't the end. True transformation would happen when she had the courage to stand up and take the first step into the unknown. Sometimes we reach that breaking point, and it feels like there's no turning back. What we've done so far seems irreparable, and the future seems cloudy. But it's in these moments that we need to remember that often, it's when all seems lost that true change begins. For Mariana, the answer didn't lie in other people's expectations or societal conventions. She needed to reconnect with her essence, with what she truly wanted for herself. What would she do at this crossroads? Which path would she take? Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever felt this way? Have you ever reached a point where everything seemed lost, but upon closer inspection, you realized this was your chance to give your life a new direction? If you've experienced something like this, or are going through it now, know that you're not alone. Transformation begins with the decision to look within and seek true freedom. If this story touched you, leave a comment, share with those who can benefit from this message, and subscribe on the channel for more stories of overcoming and reflection that can change your life. We're together on this journey of transformation. Mariana couldn't escape them. Expectations were everywhere, like an invisible weight she carried on her shoulders every day. It began when she was still young, when her parents, their eyes shining with pride, told her she had a brilliant future ahead of her. Like any devoted daughter, she embraced that future with all her might, vowing to be the perfect daughter, the exemplary professional, the person who would make everyone proud. But the more she tried to live up to them, the more the expectations multiplied, like a mountain that, with each step taken, only seemed to grow. At the dinner table, her father always talked about his own struggles, the dreams he'd had but never realized, and at some point, without words, he transferred those unfulfilled dreams to Mariana. He never demanded that she be anything she didn't want to be, but the way he spoke, the sparkle in his eyes, the pride etched on his face, it all felt like a burden, an unspoken mission. And so, it was natural that she followed this path, always striving to be the daughter he dreamed of, even if, deep down, she felt she didn't fit in. Her mother, on the other hand, talked about stability, about getting married, having children, and living a peaceful life. Conversations with her never focused on grand feats or bold dreams. They were more about living a safe, predictable life. Mariana tried to be the daughter her mother expected, the daughter who built her dream home, with every room well organized, a smile on her face, and her life under control. But she felt that, deep down, there was something missing, a void that stability couldn't fill. And then there were her friends who were always around her, sharing her dreams and achievements. They said, "Mariana, you already have everything you need to reach the top. You have so much potential." They saw her as the person who had the answers, who knew what to do, who was always confident. For them, she was a role model. But how could she be a role model for others when she could barely find herself within herself? As time passed, she felt more and more that people saw her as someone who had already achieved success, who was already on the right path. But that was precisely the lie. She wasn't well. She wasn't happy. And despite everything, no one saw it. The worst was when someone mentioned her career. "You've come so far, Mariana. Just one more push. You're almost there." They spoke as if work were everything, as if the only measure of success was the position she held, the title she held, the salary she received. But that was only part of her life. She knew this, but she couldn't shout from the rooftops that it wasn't enough, that title, that recognition didn't bring her the peace she so desperately sought. So Mariana began living for others, for everyone's expectations of her. She put on a smile and carried on, day after day, doing what was expected of her. The pressure was overwhelming. When she finally got home, alone in her room, she wondered why she felt so heavy, so frustrated. How could she be surrounded by so many people who loved her and still feel so empty? The world was seeing a Mariana, but she no longer recognized herself in that image. It was as if the expectations of others had become a prison, an invisible prison, but as real as the heaviest chains. Every step she took to please her parents, friends, and co-workers only pushed her further away from who she truly wanted to be. She found herself drowning in commitments, in responsibilities that weren't hers, but that took shape as if they were an extension of her very identity. The external pressure was suffocating her freedom, and no matter how hard she tried to free herself from it, she felt herself becoming more and more enmeshed. Mariana began to question herself. Did I really choose all this? Or was it other people's expectations that led me here? But as she asked this question, she knew it was harder than it seemed. How could she confront the people she loved, the ones who had always trusted her, without seeming ungrateful or selfish? How could she tell everyone that, behind the facade of success, she felt completely lost? External pressure became an invisible, but present, monster. And worst of all, she didn't know how to escape it. Mariana had everything that should have been a recipe for happiness: a good career, a loving family, friends by her side. But inside, she was broken. The quest for approval from everyone around her had become the trap that kept her blind to her own truth. But what would she do when that pressure became unbearable? When she found herself on the verge of giving in, not for lack of strength, but because she no longer knew who she was? Mariana was about to make a life-changing decision. But before anything else, she needed to understand that other people's expectations could no longer be the weight that guided her. She needed to find the courage to listen to herself, and more importantly, live for herself. If you've ever felt pressured by external expectations, know that you're not alone. What do you really want for your life? What do you really need to be happy? If this story touched you, leave your like. Share it with someone who is also going through something similar, and subscribe on the channel to continue following stories of transformation and reflection. Let's discover together the freedom to live for ourselves. The first few days at her new job had been marked by the adrenaline of achievement. Mariana remembered how her heart raced upon receiving the offer, how the words, "You're hired," reverberated in her mind like a personal victory. In that moment, everything felt right. She imagined herself climbing the career ladder, achieving the financial stability she so desperately desired, and living the life she always thought would answer her questions. The job, which seemed like the solution to her desires, would become her silent prison. But Mariana didn't know it yet. The clock struck 9 a.m. when she arrived at the office. The glass doors of the corporate building gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting the silhouettes of her colleagues who, like her, seemed trapped in a routine they didn't dare question. At first, the team's energy motivated her. Conversations focused on results, ambitions, and growth. The coffee they shared during the break was a brief respite before another race against time. We're building something, she thought, and that seemed to be enough. But little by little, the glow of the first few months began to fade. Small signs began to appear, but Mariana tried to ignore them. The repetitive tasks, the workload, the endless deadlines, everything blended into an exhausting routine. At first, she thought it was just a phase. "I'm still new here. This will pass," she told herself, trying to convince her heart that the wear and tear was only temporary. But it wasn't. Stress began to dominate her thoughts, even outside of work. The endless meetings, the numbers that never closed, the deadlines that always approached faster than she imagined. The words, "It's not personal, it's just work," became a repeated mantra. But the truth was, she was beginning to feel as if work was, in fact, too personal a part of her life. She could no longer separate her identity from her position. When someone asked how she was, the automatic response was always busy, as if her life were a succession of tasks she could barely complete. The emotional toll wasn't just physical. Mariana began to feel less present, less connected to the small moments of pleasure that once filled her time. Breakfast with her mother, relaxed conversations with friends, reading a book she loved. All of this was lost, day after day, due to a tight schedule that held her hostage. Her eyes became tired, her smile more forced, and work, once a project full of possibilities, now became a burden. The office walls seemed ever higher, and the feeling of being trapped within them was inescapable. And it wasn't just the work itself that made her feel this way. It was the invisible pressure that crept in with every unanswered email, every task not completed on time, every meeting that dragged on late into the night. She began to wonder, is this what I want for my life? Is this routine all I can hope for? Doubt turned to frustration, and frustration to despair. The people around her didn't seem to understand. Her coworkers were immersed in the same cycle, and any attempt to express their dissatisfaction was ignored or minimized. That's how it is, Mariana. It's just a phase. That's just how professional life is, they said. But who, deep down, was willing to truly look at the suffering behind the facade of productivity? She began to observe others differently. The people around her, all swallowed up in routine, seemed to be living in a parallel reality, one where hours were marked by commitments rather than genuine feelings. Everyone there seemed to go with the flow without question, as if time were an infinite commodity, without considering what was lost along the way. Mariana knew that, as she wore herself out, the hours were passing, and worse, she felt, increasingly disconnected from who she truly was. It was a vicious cycle. The more she tried to accomplish her tasks, the more trapped she felt. The emails kept coming, the demands increased, and she found herself increasingly distant from her true self. But at the same time, something inside her began to question. Is it worth it to continue like this? Is it worth losing myself to something that ultimately doesn't bring me happiness? This doubt, which began as a timid seed, soon spread through her mind like a flame that took over her entire being. One afternoon, when the clock finally struck 6 p.m., Mariana gathered her things and stared blankly at her office. She no longer knew if work was worth more than her own mental health, her relationships, or her dreams. The feeling of being trapped grew stronger, but the fear of change prevented her from taking any action. What would happen if she abandoned all this? What would happen if she didn't follow what the world told her she should do? Mariana still didn't know the answer. She only knew that something inside her had changed, and this emptiness she felt could no longer be ignored. The job that once seemed the key to her future now seemed the greatest obstacle to her freedom. The question remained, how long could she endure living in an emotional prison of her own making? Mariana always believed that love would be the safe haven where she could anchor her insecurities. When she met Carlos, his smile was the light she'd been searching for. He seemed to be everything she needed. Kind, attentive, present. From the beginning, she felt embraced by a silent promise of stability, of complicity. And indeed, the first few months were like a fairy tale. They laughed together, shared dreams and secrets, and she believed with all her might that she had found the person with whom she would spend the rest of her life. But the routine slowly set in, like a fog that takes over the air without anyone noticing. At first, the small gestures of affection were genuine and spontaneous. Carlos always cared, calling to ask how Mariana's day had been, wanting to know what she was thinking. But as time passed, something began to change, almost imperceptibly. The messages weren't sent as frequently. The conversations became more empty, more automated. Carlos seemed to disappear, but his body was still there. Mariana no longer knew what had happened to that attentive man, so full of love and energy. The tension between them began to grow like an invisible but palpable weight. They barely looked each other in the eye, and their previously small arguments began to grow more intense. Every word exchanged seemed to carry a heavy meaning, as if each sentence were laden with accusation, or worse yet, indifference. Mariana wondered when exactly their love had turned into a silent battlefield. Where were the promises of partnership, of growing together? She tried to understand what had happened. During the first tense days, she wondered if it was temporary, if it was just a difficult time that all relationships go through. But the days turned into weeks, and the feeling of suffocation grew ever more present. Carlos began to become more possessive, more controlling. He questioned where she was, what she was doing, who she was talking to. Nothing about Mariana made sense to him. The small gestures of affection had given way to demands, complaints, and a constant emotional pressure that made her feel small and lost. The worst part was that she couldn't understand whether she still loved him or if she was just trapped in an idea of what love should be. Had the relationship, once her refuge, now become an emotional prison? She wondered if there was still room for happiness within that relationship. It was as if she were in a dark place, unsure of which direction to take, but at the same time, guilt haunted her. He's still the person I chose. How can I even think of giving up? The fear of rejection, failure, and judgment kept her grounded in that situation. But Mariana knew, deep down, that something was deeply wrong. She tried desperately to remember the good times, the times that made her fall in love with him. But the truth was, every time she remembered them, the bad times seemed to eclipse the good. Carlos's smile, which had once made her heart race, now seemed forced and distant. He didn't look at her the same way. He didn't listen to her the same way. All he saw was the woman he wanted her to be, not who she really was. And once again she found herself lost, unsure whether to fight for that love or let it dissolve amidst exhaustion and emotional emptiness. Mariana began to realize that her own needs were being erased. What she wanted, what she felt, no longer seemed to matter. She wondered if this was the price she paid for a relationship. Love should be light, a constant exchange of care and affection. But instead, she felt as if she were carrying the weight of a relationship that was slowly undermining her. Every attempt to talk seemed to turn into a battle, an emotional war where no one won. She was so caught up in trying to please him, in trying to be what he wanted, that she forgot to be herself. Does he really love me? The question echoed in his mind constantly. But perhaps the most painful question was, do I still love myself? She no longer knew who she was, so absorbed in trying to make things work with Carlos that she lost her identity in the process. What was once a relationship based on complicity, the exchange of love and trust, now became a cycle of dissatisfaction and frustration. She didn't want to be that person, that woman who lost herself to please another. She didn't want to be that woman who was sacrificing herself to keep up appearances. Her gaze in the mirror now wasn't that of someone filled with love and hope, but of a woman beginning to realize how much she had lost. Mariana found herself trapped in a suffocating relationship, in a love that no longer nourished her soul. And the question that haunted her most was whether she should keep trying, or if she should finally break away from it all, and for the first time, breathe. And so, she found herself in a dilemma. What to do when the relationship you believe to be your source of happiness begins to become your greatest burden? How to escape a place where you feel trapped, unsure of what is still love and what has already turned into pain. Mariana felt lost, unsure of what to do. What would be left of her if she left? Was she ready to live without him? Or was the fear of being alone greater than the pain of continuing in this suffocating relationship? The truth is, even as she asked herself this, something inside her already knew the answer. But the courage to make that decision was still far away as she could imagine. Mariana found herself once again, sitting alone on the living room sofa, her mind overflowing with thoughts and questions that seemed unanswerable. The house was silent, only the sound of the wind hitting the windows breaking the emptiness of that gray afternoon. It was a heavy silence, a silence that reflected the weight of the choices she had made throughout her life. She closed her eyes and, for the first time in a long time, tried to look within herself, at what was really going on in her mind and heart. What happened to that idealistic young woman, full of dreams and plans for the future? How did she get here, to this moment of solitude, to this breaking point? She no longer had any answers. Over the years, the decisions she made seemed to accumulate, like pieces of a puzzle she was trying to put together. But the more she put them together, the more out of place they became. He remembered when he was younger, when the world seemed full of possibilities. I've always been so determined, she thought. remembering the day she decided to enroll in college. At that moment, the future seemed clear, a straight line she could follow with confidence. She had dedicated herself to her studies, made friends, built a career path, and at first, it all seemed to make sense. But now, as she reflected on all she had achieved, she felt as if none of it had been done for herself. Every choice seemed to have been made for something or someone else, rather than for what she truly wanted. Did I really choose what I wanted for myself? Or was I just fulfilling expectations? Mariana remembered conversations with her parents when she was still in high school. Her father always talked about the importance of a good job and stability, and she, with a heart full of dreams, believed that following that path would be the key to happiness. It would be safer for all of us. And she, in her innocence, followed this advice, with the promise that one day, with her own efforts, she would finally achieve freedom. But in that moment, she began to realize that this freedom was a lie, built on the foundation of what others expected of her. And then there was Carlos. She couldn't forget him. She tried to justify their relationship, tried to convince herself that he was the man she was meant to be with, the man who would give meaning to her life. She remembered the beginning, the promises he made, the sweet words she believed. I always wanted to be the woman he wanted. I always wanted to be enough for him. But now, with a clearer mind, she understood that this desire to please him, to fit into his mold, had been a mistake. She had lost herself in her quest to please someone who, deep down, no longer saw her as the person she was. Everything she had built seemed to be based on the fear of rejection, of not being enough. Mariana wondered if, by trying to please others, she had stopped being who she truly was. The pain of realizing this swallowed her hard. How many choices have I made out of fear? She thought. How many times have I chosen what was easier, what was safer, instead of what I really wanted? Each answer she found seemed to only generate more questions, as if her life were a sequence of events, a succession of choices that had led her to this exact moment of frustration and exhaustion. She no longer knew what she truly was. She no longer knew what she wanted for herself. Mariana looked out the window, watching the rain begin to fall. The sound of the drops hitting the glass seemed to accompany the storm raging in her mind. The years she had spent dedicating herself to work, trying to build a stable future, trying to live up to the expectations of everyone around her, now seemed like nothing more than a game of hide and seek. She hid from herself, running away from her own needs and desires, trying to live up to what others expected of her. And now, that was the question that haunted her, a question she knew she needed to answer, but didn't know how. How could I have missed so much? She thought of all the people who had crossed her path, the well-meaning advice, her parents' expectations, the promises of stability she believed would make her happy. Each of these elements had been a piece of the puzzle that had led her to this point. But now she found herself unsure how to put these pieces together to create something that made sense. And the hardest part of all was that she no longer knew if she had the strength to start all over again, to finally pursue something that was truly hers, something that was based on what she wanted, not what others expected. Mariana found herself immersed in a spiral of doubt, questioning her own choices and trying to understand how she had gotten to this point. But deep down, she knew she couldn't go on like this anymore. She couldn't live the life others had designed for her. The answer perhaps lay not in easy answers, but in the choices she would make from then on. She didn't yet know which path she would take, but something inside her began to ignite. I deserve more than this. I deserve to be the person I've always dreamed of being. Maybe it was too late to go back in time, but she knew that from then on, change would begin with a single decision, choosing to live for herself, not for others. It was a long and painful process, but she was beginning to see that to understand what had brought her here, she needed to look within, acknowledge her mistakes, accept her pain, and finally take control of her life. Mariana was, for the first time, determined to find the answers she'd been searching for but she knew the real journey was still ahead. The clock seemed to run faster that night, the hours slipping down the walls like a frantic race. But Mariana couldn't stop time. She sat there, in the dark corner of the room, staring into space, trying to process the storm brewing in her mind. Fear was a shadow that loomed over every corner of her home, a silent presence that suffocated her. But more than anything, it was the fear of the consequences of the choice she knew she had to make, but refused to accept. The decision was before her, and she knew it. The choice to face everything that held her back, or continue living a lie. The suffocating relationship with Carlos, the job that was slowly devouring her, the life she had built based on external expectations. All of it teetered on the brink, waiting for her answer. But what would happen if she simply left it all behind? What would happen if she decided to live for herself? The doubt kept growing inside her, like a snowball rolling downhill, increasing in size and weight. What if I lose everything I've built? What if this change is irreparable? These were the questions echoing in her mind, becoming increasingly amplified as she tried to convince herself that staying there, in her comfort zone, was the safest choice. But deep down, she knew this safety was an illusion. She was already suffocating. Every thought about the decision brought even greater fear. What if people don't understand me? What if my family, my friends, think I'm a failure? The weight of others' gaze was an immense burden. She wondered how everyone would react. What would her mother think, seeing her daughter give up a seemingly solid relationship, a job that, though tiring, paid the bills? What would her father, who had always encouraged her to have stability, to follow the safe path, say? The fear of disappointing those she loved was almost unbearable, but at the same time, she knew that living for others was no longer an option. Carlos, on the other hand, would be a different battle. The thought of looking him in the eye and telling him she couldn't continue the relationship left her paralyzed. She knew the decision to break up with him wouldn't be easy. He wouldn't understand. He didn't want to change. He believed that, despite everything, they were still fine. And the most terrifying thing was the thought that maybe he was right. Was she being too selfish? Was love, even suffocating, still worth it? Mariana felt paralyzed, as if she were being pushed off a cliff without seeing the bottom. What if I make a mistake? What if the consequences are more than I can bear? The fear of not being able to rebuild her life after such a radical choice was overwhelming. She wondered if the freedom she so desperately desired was truly worth the price she would have to pay. The pain of remaining in the situation she was in was also something Mariana couldn't ignore. She knew she could no longer live that lie. She could no longer be the woman everyone expected, the woman who sacrificed herself in the name of a love that suffocated her, who devoted herself to a job that consumed her, who placed everyone's expectations above her own needs. But at the same time, the fear of the consequences made her hesitate. The fear of losing what she had already built. The fear of losing herself even more in the process. The feeling that it might be too late to turn back. All of this formed a web that trapped her, that made her take one step forward and 2 steps back. Am I strong enough to handle what comes next? This question repeated itself incessantly, like a sad song that played over and over in his mind. She looked out the window, watching the rain fall outside. It was a silent rain, but it seemed to reflect the turmoil going on inside her. How could she make a decision that would change everything? How could she risk everything she had built to live the life she felt she truly deserved? What if the pain of change was greater than the pain of continuing to live as she was? The night dragged on, and Mariana knew she could no longer postpone this decision. Fear, though present, no longer held the same power. She knew the price of continuing on that path was greater than the price of moving forward and facing the unknown. The consequences, however terrifying, could not be heavier than the emotional prison she already lived in. She could no longer live in fear of loss. She knew that by losing what was no longer hers, she would finally have the chance to gain something much greater, the freedom to be who she truly was. It was difficult, but Mariana knew at that moment that whatever choice she made, She would have to pay the price. And perhaps the biggest mistake was letting fear decide for her. I can't go on like this, she whispered to herself as the weight of the decision began to dissipate, leaving room for something else. Courage. The courage to face the consequences. Mariana no longer knew who to turn to. She felt alone, even surrounded by the people she loved most. The weight of the decision crushed her, and in an attempt to find some answer, she desperately sought advice. Perhaps if someone told her what to do, she wouldn't have to face this abyss alone. Someone has to know what the best way is, she thought. Someone has to have the answer for me. She decided to start with the person she trusted most, her mother. Calling her was a relief, the touch of a safe haven. Mariana knew her mother would understand, that she could finally vent without fear of judgment. The phone rang, and her mother's familiar, soft voice sounded on the other end. She tried to hide the tremor in her voice, but failed. "Hi, Mom. I need help." Her mother, with her characteristic calm, welcomed her immediately. But upon hearing her words, Mariana realized the conversation wouldn't be as simple as she imagined. "What's going on, daughter? Why are you so distressed?" Mariana took a deep breath and began to tell her story. She talked about the strain of work, the pressure she felt in her relationships, and how lost she felt. Her mother, always so practical, listened attentively, without interruption. Finally, in a calm voice, she said, "Daughter, you know what you have to do. Life has its ups and downs, and everyone goes through difficult times. But if you're not happy, it's time to consider a change. Only you know what's best for you. Trust your instincts." The words were like a balm, but also like a thorn that stuck in her chest. She knew her mother was right, but at the same time, she felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. What if I make a mistake? What if this change isn't what I really need? Mariana closed her eyes, feeling an even greater emptiness grow inside her. I am the only one responsible for this decision. Still with no answers, she called her best friend. Teresa had always known how to give practical advice, always with a smile and a laugh, ready to relax. Mariana needed someone who would make her feel that everything would be okay, that help wouldn't come with the weight of responsibility, but with a bit of lightness. Teresa answered the call, and Mariana immediately plunged into a conversation filled with insecurity and fear. "I don't know what to do anymore, Teresa. I'm lost between continuing and changing. I don't know which is the right path." Teresa, as always, was direct. "Mariana, you've been through so much and overcome so many difficulties. You're not alone in this process, and the answers are within you. I can't make this decision for you, and honestly, no one can. What I can tell you is that if what you're experiencing is making you unhappy, maybe it's time to let go. Sometimes, the best thing is to start over." Mariana tried to process what Teresa said, but the weight of doubt still lingered. But what happens next? What if I can't handle the consequences? What if I lose everything? Teresa, with her firm and confident voice, replied, "Mariana, losing what you have now may be exactly what you need to find what's missing. Only you know how far you can go. But remember, change is a choice that will always bring something new, and you have the strength to move forward." Even with Teresa's support, the emptiness inside her wouldn't go away. Each piece of advice seemed to float through her mind like a leaf carried by the wind, without anchoring deep in her heart. "I know everyone wants the best for me," thought Mariana, "but the decision has to be mine. No one else can live my life." She hung up the phone and sat in silence for a few minutes. Her mother's and Teresa's words swirled in her mind, but as comforting as they were, they couldn't erase the fact that the final decision was hers, and hers alone. "I can't keep waiting for someone to tell me what to do." At that moment, Mariana realized something crucial. As much as she sought answers in the words of those who loved her, what truly mattered was what she felt inside, what she wanted for her own life. "I have to take the reins. I'm the one who has to live with the consequences, and I'm the one who has to take the first step." Although her mother's and Teresa's advice had been important, Mariana understood that neither of them could make decisions for her. No one could make the choice about who she wanted to be, or how she wanted to live. She needed to finally listen to her own inner voice and have the courage to follow her heart's desires. And in that moment, Mariana felt closer to the truth than ever. She knew the change would be painful, that the next steps wouldn't be easy, but the answer was already there, inside her. The decision, finally, was hers. It was a quiet morning when Mariana finally decided to take a step back. The soft sound of rain against the windows seemed to create the perfect backdrop for the kind of reflection she'd been putting off for so long. Conversations with her mother, with Teresa, with her co-workers, everything seemed distant now. The words of others, so full of good intentions, no longer made sense. She felt as if she were lost in a maze of advice, all pointing in different directions, but none truly resonating with her heart. That morning, Mariana didn't know what to look for. She had no map, no ready-made answers. But there was something inside her, a growing sense that the key to all her doubts lay not in what she might hear from others, but in the silence she hadn't, yet dared to face. The silence she had always feared. The silence of her own soul. She sat on the sofa, hands on her knees, closing her eyes and letting her thoughts come, in no hurry to push them away. She saw herself once again, in that same room, but now with a different clarity, without the distractions of routine, without the weight of work, without the pressure of a suffocating relationship. She allowed herself to feel. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to simply exist. Who am I, really? The question came without warning. It was no longer about what people expected of her, or what she had done or achieved so far. It wasn't about the commitments she had made, or the choices she believed would lead her to success. It wasn't about titles or the approval of others. It was a pure, raw question that touched the core of who she had always been, and perhaps still could be. The answer, however, didn't come immediately. Mariana began to think about the times she felt most alive, the times she experienced a moment of true happiness. She remembered being a child, when she wasn't afraid to dream, when she saw the world with curious eyes and an open heart. She remembered sitting in the park and simply watching the movement of the trees, the lightness of the wind, and the sound of children's laughter playing. It was a time when there was no pressure, a time when she felt completely connected to what truly mattered. But as she grew older, the weight of the world began to take hold. Expectations began to fill the space in her soul, like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't chosen. I lost myself. I let myself get lost. Mariana realized something deeply painful, but also liberating. I no longer knew what was mine. I had distanced myself from myself. The pain of realizing she had strayed from her true self was profound. But at the same time, something within her began to shift. She realized the answer to her transformation was right in front of her, as if it had always been there, waiting to be seen. I already knew what I needed to do. I was just scared. The fear wasn't just of the unknown, but of what it would truly mean to be true to herself. She feared she wouldn't be able to face the consequences of living the life she truly wanted. But there was something in her mind that lit up in that stillness. Fear was natural, but it should no longer rule her. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the ability to move forward in spite of it. Mariana felt a wave of calm spread throughout her body. She was no longer looking for answers in the outside world, because the answer was already within her. She needed to trust what she felt, not what others told her was right for her, what she had looked for in other people and situations. What she sought in work and relationships was simply confirmation of what she already knew, but didn't want to accept. She needed to reconnect with herself, with her own desires and needs, and no longer live to satisfy other people's expectations. She began to visualize in her mind what her life would be like if she finally took control, if she chose to follow the path her heart was asking, no matter how challenging. Mariana saw herself moving toward a version of herself no longer trapped in a job that was destroying her, a relationship that was suffocating her. She saw herself being free, being herself, without constraints, without fear of making mistakes. True transformation, she understood, wouldn't come from external change. It wouldn't be a decision she'd make just to please others or to follow a well-trodden path. True transformation would begin within herself. I am the key. I always have been. Mariana opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a long sleep. She felt a renewed strength within herself, a strength she knew she had but had neglected for so long. Now she knew what she needed to do. The fear was still there, but it no longer had the power to control her. She knew her journey was just beginning. She got up from the couch, and for the first time in a long time, felt like she was walking towards something real. Not a future shaped by others, but one she would choose for herself, with her own hands. Mariana was ready to take the first step. The day was dawning, and for the first time in weeks, Mariana felt a lightness in her chest. But this lightness didn't last long. The fear, as always, was there. Present, invisible, but unmistakable. It crept into the corners of her mind, threatening to dissolve the peace she was beginning to feel. What if I fail? What if this change doesn't get me anywhere? These questions began to form, one by one, like a relentless tide. She knew the path she was about to choose wouldn't be easy. Change meant taking risks, leaving behind a life of security, a life that, though stifling, was predictable. Deep down, Mariana knew the real question wasn't whether she could make it, but how paralyzing the fear of failure and change could be. Sitting at the coffee table, a cup in her hands, she stared out the window, watching the raindrops slowly fall. Each drop seemed to descend with quiet determination. Rain never fears falling. It makes its way to the ground. She found herself thinking, almost as if the outside world was trying to teach her something. What Mariana was really facing wasn't just the fear of failure. It was the doubt about whether she was, in fact, making the right choice. The fear of risking what she already had, her job, her relationship, the security of a familiar routine, was paralyzing. And what distressed her even more was the idea that, by taking this step into the unknown, she could end up losing everything. What would happen if she couldn't handle the consequences? What if, in trying to be free, she actually failed? But what Mariana realized was that the stagnation, the paralysis she was experiencing, the fear of taking the first step, that was indeed an even greater risk. The idea of continuing in a life that didn't fulfill her, that didn't make her feel authentic, was a silent but constant torture. She began to realize that in truth, there was nothing more frightening than continuing to live like this, automatically, without finding her true essence. What happens if I don't change? What happens if I stay in the same place, making the same kind of choices, living a life that isn't mine? The thought came as a shock to her. Stagnation, the life she was leading, wasn't just a choice of comfort. It was also a silent risk that kept her trapped in a cycle of mediocrity. She felt life slipping through her fingers, the opportunities lost, the days that would never return. The life she had chosen for herself was becoming a prison, and the fear of escaping it was consuming her. Mariana remembered a phrase she had always heard, but which now made perfect sense. The greatest failure is not trying. The words resonated within her, like a drumbeat, like a warning she could no longer ignore. She suddenly understood that the fear of failure was masking an even greater fear, the fear of not trying, the fear of not giving her true happiness even a chance. She closed her eyes, feeling the tension in her shoulders. The fear was still there, but now, for the first time, she looked him in the eye. Yes, I can fail, but if I don't try, that will be a much bigger failure. She thought about all the things she had learned so far, how she had realized that sometimes what we fear most is not failure itself, but what it represents. Failure wasn't the end. It was just part of a process. It was necessary for growth, for change, for evolution. Not trying, however, meant living an incomplete life without truly exploring what it could be. Mariana felt that, deep down, this fear, this doubt, were merely shadows of a greater decision, a transformation she knew she needed to embrace. And as she looked at what truly mattered, she realized there was no more time to waste. The fear wouldn't disappear, but she could learn to live with it. She would no longer be dominated by it. The fear of failure would now be a sign that she was about to embark on a new path, a path of courage, a path where failures would be part of the learning process, not the end of the journey. I can't wait any longer. I need to take this step. I need to take a risk. Those words were like a fire ignited within her. Mariana could no longer postpone her happiness. Her life, the risk of not changing, was greater than the risk of failing. Stagnation was already killing her true essence, and she knew she could no longer live this way. With a deep sigh, she stood and looked in the mirror. For the first time, she saw herself differently, through the eyes of someone who knew she was about to make a fateful decision, who didn't know what the future would bring, but who, at least, would be living the life she had chosen for herself. The fear was still there, but now it was no longer an obstacle. It was, in fact, a reminder that she was alive, that change was within her reach. Mariana felt a strength within herself, a strength she knew would come from within. The true failure, she finally understood, was not the mistake. Failure would be continuing to live in a world where she would never have the courage to change. The night was silent, but inside, Mariana was a whirlwind of emotions. The words of the people she loved, the advice she received, the doubts that haunted her, all of it was behind her now, like distant echoes that no longer held the same weight. She was standing before herself, faced with the only decision that mattered, her own. For the first time in her life, Mariana no longer needed to see herself through the eyes of others. She finally understood that, to be happy, she needed to see herself through her own eyes. For months, she had been trapped by fear, doubt, and the desire to please. For months, she had lived for others, for the dreams and expectations of her parents, friends, colleagues, and even Carlos. The pressure to be the woman everyone expected, the outstanding professional, the friend who was always available, the daughter who never disappointed, all of it suffocated her. But now, in that moment, she knew that the greatest burden was this: living a life that wasn't hers. The real prison wasn't the choices she made, but those she made to please others, to avoid the discomfort of rejection and disapproval. Mariana closed her eyes for a moment. She took a deep breath, feeling the air move in and out of her lungs, as if it were the first time she had truly breathed. I am the only one responsible for my happiness. Those words, which she had feared so much, were now engraved on her soul. She felt a growing lightness within her, a sense of freedom that embraced her as if she were finally going home. The decision wouldn't be easy. She knew it. Leaving behind everything she'd built, risking what she knew to embrace the unknown, was a leap into the void. But deep down, Mariana knew that true failure wasn't in making mistakes. Failure was continuing to live a lie, continuing to sacrifice herself for something that didn't fulfill her. It wasn't about the approval of others, nor about pleasing anyone. It was about being true to who she was, about living the life she chose, not the one imposed upon her. The final decision arose within her, like a silent but powerful scream. I will live for myself. This was the hardest step, but also the most liberating. She no longer needed to wait for anyone's permission. She no longer needed to conform to what others expected. The truth was simple and clear. Mariana had the right to be happy in her own way, by herself. The decision to move on, to end the relationship that was suffocating her, to leave the job that consumed her, wasn't a rejection of the people around her. It was an affirmation of self-love, a declaration that her happiness was no longer in anyone's hands, but her own. The fear didn't disappear, but it no longer paralyzed her. Fear became simply a sign that she was on the right path, and it was with a heart full of courage that she took the first step into the unknown, knowing that by doing so, she was freeing herself from everything that held her back. Mariana felt a wave of gratitude for herself. She knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy, but the peace she now felt in her soul was stronger than any fear. For the first time, she was living the life she'd always wanted, the life she'd always known deep down she deserved. And now, I ask you, who are reading these words? What is your real decision? Are you ready to live for yourself, to pursue the happiness that's within your reach, even if it means making a difficult decision? Sometimes the first step is the hardest, but when you allow yourself to be who you truly are, life begins to unfold in surprising ways. If this story touched your heart, leave your like, share with someone who also needs to hear these words, and subscribe in the channel for more inspiring stories of transformation and overcoming. Remember, the key to change is within you. The power to be happy is in your hands.